Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to a poem that will be for us difficult to read for a number of reasons. Year that trembled and reeled beneath me. This is the 20th poem of the 43 of Drum Taps. And we said that when we hit Wound Dresser, which is our next poem at 21, we are right in the middle of Drum Taps. So this is one of those poems that kind of gestures towards what we'll soon meet. Some have said that Whitman in this poem reaches his lowest moment of despair. We said about Whitman in earlier lectures that he always said that he prefers the sunny side. And of course, it is an optimism. Some would call it an overly optimistic view in Leaves of Grass. So we've argued that what we've called it is an informed optimism. And one of the reasons we can say that it's informed, in other words, self-chosen, if you will, is because of a poem like this. You will remember that in To Thee, O Cause, early in our study of Leaves of Grass, Whitman speculated that my book and the war are one. Now, the ways in which they are one, I think, has something to say. And I want to remind you, although I haven't said this, the way Whitman loves to play with words, you can think about the word one as having two spellings, right? There is, of course, the way he uses it here is O-N-E, but there's also W-O-N, that idea of victory. I think, you know, it's fun to speculate on how Whitman might smile if in a chat with Walt we were to say, you know, that's funny that we can see it both ways. Now, I have argued that Leaves of Grass in the lectures I've given thus far is a sustained theodicy. My assumption is you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt, and you've been annotating as you have been working through all these poems. We've started with the first word come up through inscriptions and everything afterwards. We've given a set of introductory comments to Drum Taps, and we just finished with Not the Pilot. And we've argued so much that what Whitman is trying to do is to explain. Milton in Paradise Lost, of course, calls it justify the ways of God to men. But I think Whitman is trying to explain why there must be pain and suffering in the world, especially, of course, the pain and suffering of the war. Now, our Nortons, as we will always refer to for our background information, will tell us that this poem remained unchanged in Drum Taps through all editions. The year that we're talking about may be 1863-64, which saw many critical actions, some would call it reversals. Whitman wrote a piece called The Wounded from Chancellorsville that dates May of 1863. And that set of comments suggests that there was tremendous fear of what was happening. 1863 to 1963, as we have said, and of course in our lecture on Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. What an amazing parallel years between those 100 years. 1863, it was a year of reverses. Of course, Charleston, and we mentioned Chancellorsville. We will notice the difference, for example, between this poem and a poem like Beat Beat Drums at the beginning of Drum Taps. As I said to you, you can read Drum Taps as the way a nation goes to war. It will begin, of course, with a certain kind of enthusiasm, dare we say it, excitement, and then you'll begin to have the question of what are we doing and how are we going to get out of this. There is, of course, great fear when Whitman is living in 63, as was all of those in the D.C. area, that General Lee might just finally make his way into the city and it would all be over. This is the way that he says it, year that trembled and reeled beneath me. Year that trembled and reeled beneath me. Your summer wind was warm enough, yet the air I breathed froze me. A thick gloom fell through the sunshine and darkened me. Must I change my triumphant songs, said I to myself? Must I indeed learn to chant the cold dirges of the baffled and sullen hymns of defeat? It is, maybe we're looking at the lowest moment in Whitman's poetic career. There will be a few poems to come that will challenge it, but I think this is one of the most honest statements, and again, we're back to this notion of the sustained theodicy, that Whitman will provide Notice he begins with two words that only get used one time in all of Leaves of Grass, trembled and reeled. It's fascinating to me that for all of the sexuality of Leaves of Grass, and certainly there is some there, that the word trembled never gets used in any kind of sexual way, but rather here, as in horrifying fear. The reeled word is also an interesting word because there's this notion of tumbling, reeling, and of course that idea of spinning, what Yeats will call later the gyre, as he talks about it in Second Coming. I think there's a whole lot of Second Coming in this poem, right? Turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. I think that idea, that sentiment is here echoed. And notice it is beneath me. We've talked about so much the prepositions, and here notice it's an exclamation point to drive the point home. Then to speak of the year and the summer wind, it was warm enough, and there's some irony here because 63 was a warm summer. Yet the air I breathed froze me. And notice it's not froze us, it is me. This is a profound statement of what it means to live in this time of complete and total uncertainty. What's going to happen? And then he says it, a thick gloom. We've had dim, we've had uncertain, we've had unknown, all these words that will be built as a centerpiece of the Drum Taps poem. Fell through the sunshine, which is interesting because, as we said, Whitman said in one of his piece of prose writings that he tries to have keep the sunny side. And here, notice, the sunshine is being overcome. Darkened me. The idea of darkening. We've seen it so many times. Matthew Arnold will pick up with this with Dover Beach on a darkling plain when he tries to qualify another moment in history that is dim, that is uncertain. And then he uses two musts, and he has these questions. Notice three of them. He says, must I change my triumphant songs? And I mean, it's a fair question. In other words, was I wrong? This is why I argue Leaves of Grass is a sustained theodicy. Was I wrong? I had hoped for, right? And now, look, this year is horrific. He says, said I to myself, of course, song of myself is being echoed here, no question. Must I indeed learn to chant? And this idea again of chanting is one central to Leaves of Grass. The cold dirges of the baffled. Again, the only time cold dirges gets used in all Leaves of Grass is right here. Of course, the word baffled takes us back up to Not the Pilot when he says beaten back and many times baffled. This was really the word, I think, in many ways, that so many readers of Leaves of Grass drum taps, they resonated with this word. Like, it's baffling. I mean, it's baffling on so many counts. All these people are being slaughtered for the right to own another person. It's insane. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and yet here we are. And this is what we're doing. Fathers killing sons, sons killing fathers, brothers killing brothers, and the like. I mean, it's absolutely insane. How can it happen? And of course, as we will remind ourselves here in a moment, 1863 was the year of Gettysburg. Must I indeed learn to chant the old dirges of the baffled? And then he finishes with almost just like a half question, and sullen hymns of defeat. You'll remember this word sullen from Song of Myself 43. And you'll remember this word of defeat from Pioneers, O Pioneers, with through the battle, through defeat, never stopping. All of a sudden, it starts to look as if maybe Whitman is ready to give up. Maybe he has this question in the back of his mind that this experiment is somehow, called democracy, is somehow going to fail. I think at 2A, we can take this message that even the most optimistic poets or artists sometimes struggle with having hope for the future. If you find yourself living now in the time that you are living, and you are struggling to believe that there is cause to hope, you pick up a poem like this and you go, oh yeah, that's right, that's right. In the nation's history, we have been here before. We have been far worse off before, Whitman would argue. At 2B, I love the word choice. I love words like trembled and reeled, and the only time that it gets used is right here. Now at 3A, since I mentioned Gettysburg, I just want to drive home a point that I make in my lecture on Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address. And it's I've posted in the comments section if you want to go back and take a look at that at learnstrong.net. And what I say in that lecture is what I will reiterate here. Of course, this is one of the most precious speeches in the history of our nation, our proud nation. But I think often it is misread as a statement of confidence, of bold confidence. But when you look at the actual language, I think Lincoln was saying the exact same thing that Whitman is saying in this poem. Dude, I'm not sure. You will remember that the poem begins with, of course, identifying the 87 fourscore years ago. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Referencing, obviously, Jefferson, whom Whitman loved as well. He goes to the immediacy as Leaves of Grass does. I haven't done this yet. We're getting ready. We're somewhat 24 poems away from Lilacs and Memories of Lincoln. And the way in which Whitman and Lincoln are so interestingly, linguistically joined. Now, notice the use of that word as we have seen it in Leaves of Grass so regularly. We're engaged in he calls it the Great Civil War. And of course, from this moment on, it will be referenced constantly as a civil war. And then the next word is the key I want to drive home in reading this poem. Notice what Lincoln says. We're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. It is possible, Lincoln is suggesting, this may be it. It may be over. We're met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives that that nation might live. In other words, the possible death of the nation is hidden here behind the prose. It's altogether, he says, fitting and proper that we should do this. Of course, he will finish in his conclusion by saying it is for those here to be dedicated to the unfinished work. It is rather for us to here be dedicated to the great task. Again, that notion of the job that has to be done remaining before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. The idea, of course, here is that all of this death of Gettysburg and all of the other battles that happened in the year 63, we cannot allow for it to have been for nothing. In other words, we're looking at a theodicy. Can you explain all of the death, all the carnage? That this nation under God shall have a new birth. Obviously, that's very Whitman-esque language, obviously very religious language, of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people. It is the final lines of the Gettysburg Address that we will come back to Whitman's poem, shall not perish from the earth. The possibility of perishing from the earth, I think, is central to our reading as well of Year That Trembled and Reeled Beneath Me. Finally, at 3b, when was the last time, just to own a poem like this, when was the last time that you trembled and reeled? Some of you will say, dude, I'm trembling and reeling right now given some of the craziness that's going on politically, not only in America but in the world. To pick up Leaves of Grass, I think, is a way to try to address some of those baffled feelings. Thank you.